my name is Margreth Keiler. I'm here at the Department of Geography, and I'm heading there the group for geomorphology, natural hazard, and risk research. And as Sarah said, we started with the initiative to have our cluster to discuss with our colleagues here in the Geography Department and to really get to a model. And it's great that Sarah and Jorge made it able to have this workshop and that you are all here. It's a great pleasure for us, and we're looking forward for the discussion. But we are also looking really forward for the presentation now from Professor David Alexander. He came from London, from the University College of London to here. He is their Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction. We know each other since more than 10 years, something like that. We worked in projects together, and I think everybody working in disaster risk reduction knows David Alexander. It is like that because he worked since really a long time now on this topic. He went to Italy, worked there as scientific director for Advanced School of Civil Protection. He was professor at the University of Florence and developed a lot of study programs and also his knowledge to go in the whole risk cycle, the different parts, to make it also transdisciplinary, to get to the stakeholders the information and to provide the information. So have really good research, having critical papers on terms like risk and resilience, in this case, where the terms come from, but having the whole frame to it. And I think most of you are aware of all his book, starting with natural disasters, then confronting catastrophe, principle of emergency planning and management, recover from disaster, and how to write emergency plans. You see, he's really a key person in disaster risk reduction, and he's also the editor-in-chief for the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, where he really winds the part. But I think you can add a little bit more. A lot of prizes I didn't mention here, but I think we are really looking forward to get now really great insights in this discussion, and the floor is yours. Thank you that you are here.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for your unduly kind introduction. It's great to see that the age of the plastic bottle is not over. It'll make a very good Molotov cocktail, you know. Fill it full of petrol, light it, there you go. Anyway, it's my job to provide a little bit of disruptive innovation. So all aboard the Disorient Express, and let's get on with looking at where we might be going or might not be going in this field. Now, you probably, if your English is good enough, know the difference between critical and stroppy. And you can decide for yourself which of these I am. Anyway, what are we dealing with? What is our stock in trade? Well, of course, it's disasters, but we really have to see them in the light of other forms of human misery that will interact with them and that are part of the context that we're dealing with. And of course, much debate goes on at present about the possibility of ecological collapse, as well as climate change that might be one of the drivers of that. Relationship between conflict and disasters, for example, is something, and displacement, migration, human mobility and disasters is something that deserves to be investigated more, fertile ground for future work. So we're into the age of disaster risk reduction. It surprises me a little, perhaps not very much, that the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction has now rebranded itself United Nations Office for DRR. Great, mainstream and all of that. But the reality is we're actually in the age of disaster risk creation. And if you follow IRDR, that's to say not my IRDR, which is the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, but Integrated Risk and Disaster Reduction in Beijing, the World Bank funded body there. They have been working on disaster risk creation as a phenomenon worthy of study. quite right too. It is suggested, although I forget exactly where, this isn't a terribly official piece of data, that the ratio, the cure to damage ratio, is 1 to 43, which suggests that for every dollar or shekel or pound or euro spent on reducing the risk of disaster, 43 are spent on expanding it, increasing it. If that should sound ridiculous, bear in mind that it is a well-established fact that in the oil industry, the ratio is about 1 to 1,000. In other words, 1,000 times as much is spent on subsidizing fossil fuels than it is on finding alternatives to them. And that is still true, and we expect there to be increases in the use of fossil fuel in the next few years, despite the absolute imperative to create the opposite scenario. Not too good, but we live in a world in which there is that constant duality, and this is something you really need to study in these 3 days and thereafter, between things that amplify risk and things that reduce risk. Total vulnerability, then, is really a dynamic mixture, let's call it even a dialectic between these two factors, those that cause risk, create risk, enhance risk, increase risk, and those that reduce it. Which is going to win under various circumstances? That is a question to be answered in many, many different ways. And the wild card is risk perception, which could go either way. How do we perceive risk? Do we perceive it? The great challenge of the 21st century is to get people to assume more responsibility for their own risk, because experts like you cannot manage it all. You can't take the world's risk on your shoulders. Some of it may be, but certainly not all of it. So sharing out risk and the management thereof is absolutely vital. So we're also into a situation in which it is time we stopped adopting a narrow approach and we looked much more closely at context and its role in this whole process of creating or reducing disasters. There is a movement against the use of the term natural disasters. Oh dear, tut, I put it on a diagram, shame upon me, etc. Well, I wrote a book about it in 1993 when it was kosher. It was okay to describe natural disasters. And blow me, it's still in print after all these years. So somebody likes the term. Actually, personally, I think it's perfectly right to call them natural disasters because there's nothing more natural than the human tendency to create disasters. However, that's my personal view. Anyway, the point about it is that whatever the cause of disaster, natural, technological, social, intentional, i.e. terrorism, or the more common variety, composite, a mixture, whatever the cause, they will interact with a whole variety of things, and we need to look at the interaction. In my institute, we're busy studying the relationship between conflict and disasters in places like Kashmir and eastern Bangladesh, where the Rohingya are amassed, and so on. We're into the age of migration, the age of human mobility. It's not going to go away, it's going to increase. And what happens then when we get mass migration that intersects with disaster of another kind? Well, we will see. And perhaps also with the question of pandemics or epidemics. One thing to bear in mind as a sort of footnote to pandemics is that the principal effect of them is likely to be socioeconomic rather than medical. Unless, of course, you're killed by one, but anyway. So, right. Root causes, therefore, are very important. Studying context is very important. Now, we're quite used now to the idea that vulnerability and hazards are things that we have to get together in order to understand risk and impact. But it's time we devoted a lot more attention to root causes and how they influence vulnerability, plus a variety of other factors. I would call that the egg model. And it's very, very simple. I simply woke up in the middle of the night, as people who study things tend to do. Then you have a brilliant idea, and by the morning it's gone. But anyway, I thought to myself, it's utterly simple, but very true, that if you have people who are generally vulnerable, then you cannot reduce their vulnerability to specific risks if you don't reduce their general vulnerability. So, for example, we have people in Britain who are destitute. We have people whom government policy has left in a very precarious state. And if we try and reduce their vulnerability to floods, it's not going to work because they have so many other vulnerabilities that it would be a complete and utter waste of time and resources. So we need to understand very well what are the root causes of disaster and what are the contextual effects upon it that will change vulnerability, that will mix with vulnerability and probably increase it too. So understanding of root causes is absolutely vital, and IRDR in Beijing will tell you exactly the same thing. Okay, well, disaster vulnerability, therefore, is a subset of general vulnerability, and to understand disaster vulnerability, the human consequences thereof, we really need also to understand general vulnerability, bearing in mind some of the trends and tendencies we have in this world of ours. Now, about 3 years ago, I was in Geneva at the conference organised by the UN on science for Sendai, applying science to the Sendai framework. Now, science is a very good thing. The Sendai framework is a very good thing, and it would be a very good idea to apply science to it. It's a bit like what Gandhi said when asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a very good idea. But anyway, likewise, applying science, good idea. But there is a naive belief that that is what we do. We apply science and everything's all right. The reality of it is, in fact, rather different. We live in the wreckage economy. Now, during that meeting in 2016, the biennial Oxfam report came out that said that one busload of people own half of the world's disposable wealth. And the number is shrinking. I don't know what happened to the other 19 zillionaires who own so much. But anyway, it's something like 42 people own half of the world's wealth. And at current trends, by 2030, 2/3 of the world's wealth will be in the hands of a bare handful of people, enough to get comfortably onto a small bus. Now, what does that actually do to disaster risk reduction and to the state of play? Well, nobody could answer the question, but what was more significant was at this gigantic meeting with 5,000 people there, nobody except the undersigned actually tried to answer it, actually raised the question. It was the elephant in the room. So, right, we look at the hazardscape or the risk landscape, or call it what you will. We look at how people are vulnerable in specific places to specific events and impacts, but we also need to look at the right-hand side of the diagram. And there are a variety of concepts that we tend to avoid, of which, for example, welfare is one. I've just been reading a thesis on this, which was in relation to a particular storm and flood in a particular place. And it delved very deeply into the question, well, what is welfare? It didn't succeed in answering it. And the curious thing is you can look on the web and you can't find a definition of welfare. Why not? Well, it's politically expedient not to define it. That's why. It's a simple enough concept. But welfare is absolutely central to the question of what we do for people who are vulnerable to things, including disasters. We also have a variety of other concepts, such as sovereignty and mobility and so on. Sovereignty and identity are actually not very old concepts. They're about 400 years old. They perhaps stem from the Peace of Westphalia, 1628, something like that. But looking at how the question of sovereignty and the question of identity have changed over the years, if not the centuries, we start to get a picture of how the world is actually made up and what the constraints are and what you can do. And that we have to look at in the context of, oops, sorry, press the wrong button. Yeah, press the, no. So I'm not very good at these things, am I? Quite honestly. Come on, there we go. Mobility, which I think around about November 2015, we passed the threshold to a much more mobile world. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I got the wrong vibes out of what's going on in the world, but there's something up there. Mobility now is very much a fact of life. It's out of the box and we can't put the lid back on again. Things like democracy and entitlement are also important, and so are proxy wars, of which there have been about 200 since 1945, where the great powers fight each other through a third country, which at present is Syria, or perhaps it's Yemen, or somewhere like that, creating so-called complex disasters. When the term was mooted in 1992, somebody stood up and said, yes, but all disasters are complex. Indeed they are, indeed they are. But we're talking about something a little bit different, usually tied up with the idea of proxy wars, which then spread instability and vulnerability on a larger scale. Entitlement is important. What we find is that if you are to make progress in disaster reduction, democracy is vital. It guarantees access to information, if it's good democracy, that is. It entitles people to do things that they need to do to reduce risk. It does at least provide the fertile soil in which disaster risk reduction can grow. Without it, it cannot. So what I think is that whereas we're now pretty much attuned to the idea of studying hazard and studying vulnerability, although it is interesting that hazard is still the bigger partner of the two, despite the fact that in 1993, a very good book was issued by Ken Hewitt and his followers that suggested via what's known as the radical critique that it was the other way around, that vulnerability is more important than hazard. But nevertheless, hazard is the dominant partner, we'll have to live with it. Resilience is on the way up, and resilience is some say the buzzword, but let's bear in mind that resilience has been around for 2,080 years as a concept. It is not a new concept. But the point I need to make with this diagram is that the really challenging and really interesting things to study are actually the interfaces between the systems. Now, I only put 5 on the diagram for elegance's sake. There are more, but it really is the interface between, for example, social and natural, political and technical, organizational and social, organizational and natural, and so on. That's where the real challenges lie, at the interfaces. Okay, so we have 101 years of disasterology. It began with a big bang, the explosion of a munition ship in Halifax Harbour, Nova Scotia, and the work of an Anglican priest called Samuel Henry Prince, published in 1920, so that's another anniversary. We have 100 years of disasterology. I've actually been to the temple of the beginning site in Halifax and looked it over, we have 100 years. And we started with a nice simple linear model that has the advantage of simplicity and linearity. The physical event works on human vulnerability to give us the consequences. Okay, Hewitt and co. turned it round in 1983 with what came to be known as the radical critique, saying that what really matters is human vulnerability, feedback loops to the physical event, which is merely the trigger and the consequences. Okay, but here we are in the 21st century using theory that was developed in about 1965, or at least I suppose it began to be developed in 1923 and it reached its peak in the early 70s. And we're in a totally different world, totally different. For a start, the wealth disparity began in the period 1970-73. But there are also lots of other things that have supervened. For example, culture. Now, anthropologists have always studied it, but it's time the rest of us did. It's very hard to study, but there's really interesting work by a political economist called Monica Escaleras. University is Florida International University, and she did a fairly substantial study with variables, lots of them, 340 in fact, and found that the principal determinant of earthquake disasters is corruption. Interesting. Well, you can't really measure corruption. Ever tried to go up somewhere with a clipboard and say, "Excuse me, are you corrupt?" You end up with your feet encased in concrete, pushed off the bridge. So, but despite the difficulty of measuring it, that's how it appears to come out. Now, I stood up at a seismologist conference, the token social scientist, and told them that, and it went down like a lead balloon because they were absolutely convinced that all you needed to do was a bit better seismological monitoring and you've got the whole earthquakes problem squared away. But we need to look at history. It's not the perfect guide to a future, which is dynamic and will be very different to the past, but it tells us a lot of messages and lessons, and culture as well as the physical events, and how they act upon the human vulnerability. Okay, that's the move diagram, by the way. You might recognize it in very distilled form in order to make it look a bit more, well, a bit less or a bit something anyway. The point I wanted to make about it, the original diagram's a bit better than this, but it was the result of 6 days of arguing between 13 partners from 9 countries, where nobody could agree on anything, but somehow a diagram came out the end of it. The point about it, though, is that we have a tendency to put vulnerability into a whole series of categories that are determined by sort of basic dimensions or slots that we put things in. Social vulnerability, environmental vulnerability. Okay, what do you then do when you get a vulnerability that straddles the different categories? Then you really are stuck with a diagram like this. So what I suggested was a different approach where we actually look more laterally at vulnerability. It was, I'm happy to say, the basis of a book on earthquakes. They used it as their theoretical framework, which is quite gratifying. But anyway, the point of, you know something, wherever I go in the world, whenever I open my mouth to speak, someone starts drilling through concrete. It's just amazing. There are 4 different continents. However, we carry on regardless. There you go. It's absolutely on time, you know, it's almost programmed. Okay, so different kinds of vulnerability as derived simply by observation. And perhaps if we can activate some kind of model like this, then we might get a bit further with defining what vulnerability is. I have a student in Indonesia at the moment who is trying to ascertain the relationship between vulnerability and resilience. We start with the assumption that they are not absolute opposites. In other words, if you increase resilience, you're not automatically reducing vulnerability. If you reduce vulnerability, you're not automatically increasing resilience. Yes, there is overlap. Yes, there is interaction. Yes, it's probable that if you do increase resilience, you will reduce vulnerability, but they are not exact opposites that act in absolute unison. And I think the data, the results are bearing that out. So what is resilience? Well, we have to ask a lot of questions and I don't really have absolute answers. Is it an objective, a process? Is it a strategy? Is it a paradigm? Do we actually believe in paradigms? I always remember that day as a new undergraduate, I went into the London School of Economics library and there were 29 copies of Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, all well thumbed, some of them falling apart there on the shelves. And it was an obligation to read it and believe that science goes forward by paradigms. Since then, I've become skeptical. By the way, Patrick Larchitect, who is a well-known philosophical risk manager from Paris, formed a rapid reflection force. They would go to disasters and reflect on them. Well, I formed Skeptiques Sans Frontières, Skeptics Without Borders. We have a rapid skepticism force. We go to disasters and we disbelieve. But anyway, is resilience bounce back or bounce forward? Now, there's a problem there that many who use the concept got it from Buzz Holling. Crawford Stanley Holling, 1973. Many people think that he invented the concept, even though it was well used by the ancient Romans, who had 8 different definitions of it, and first used in science by Francis Bacon in London, the cradle of resilience, in 1625. And Buzz Holling's approach was homeostasis. In other words, everything goes back to equilibrium. Well, I've used for you, in disasters, there is no equilibrium, right? Don't forget it. So the Holling approach, windows open, out it goes. And that's important because an awful lot of papers are published where they uncritically, unquestioningly use Holling's approach. I've nothing against it, but it came from the age, I remember it, of small island ecology. And the thing about a small island is it's an open system for energy, but it's a closed system for mass. And that's why they studied the ecology of small islands. We're not on a small island. And what is the scale at which resilience works or doesn't work? Should we focus on the community scale? If so, what is a community? And that really is difficult. Can resilience reconcile dynamic and static elements? If we look at it in a purely static sense, we're wasting our time. By the way, don't bother to photograph it. You can actually get this presentation on your phone. Wow, the miracles of modern technology. So my favourite definition of resilience is this. It comes from Rankine, a great Scottish expert on mechanics, his textbook of 1859, in which he pointed out that a material, to be resilient, when you apply a force to it, will mobilise brittle strength. In other words, it will resist the force, but it will also deform by ductility. So as a material has strength and ductility, so society must harden, it must have resistance to the applied force, and it must adapt. Ductility means adaptation in societal terms. Simple as that. Of course, resilience isn't simple because we have all sorts of resilience in different directions for different things. But I'm afraid when we look at that diagram, we've got to go back to the egg model. In other words, think about, okay, we'll look at the top right-hand side, even at categories. But when we do so, we've got to think about the rest of the diagram, which is the context, and perhaps even more. So how do we balance vulnerability and resilience? By the way, the fence was knocked down by the tsunami in Japan. Anyway, well, we've got to look at current knowledge and how that is evolving of both concepts. We've got to look at how people organise in crisis situations and for them and after them in recovery. We've got to do a gap analysis and a resilience matrix of some kind and produce some kind of theoretical model that shows how vulnerability and resilience interact and balance each other or don't balance each other, bearing in mind the dynamic kind of it. Well, that will take you more than 3 days, but you can make a start now. Let's look at cascading disasters. Now, this is something that we formed a group to study at IRDR in London, at UCL. And we believe that most disasters will be cascades, above a very low threshold. And the reason is we live in network societies. Once again, we live in network societies, and cascades propagate through networks. We are utterly dependent on critical infrastructure. So you can start with the idea of toppling dominoes and knock-on effects. One thing happens, followed by another, examples to follow. That's the easiest way to look at it, but it is by no means complete. We can link physical and social vulnerabilities. We have to. This is not merely a technological problem. It's not a matter of tinkering with the network. It's a question of what happens when the network fails. We can look at compound and interconnected risks. And by the way, if this should appear, if you are a development specialist and this should appear to be purely a matter of rich countries like Switzerland, bear in mind the network failure in Tonga recently, for example, where Tonga lost the internet and the effect on Tonga that had. Anyway, compound and interconnected risk, more to say about that in just a minute. Non-linear progress, but above all, we're looking at amplification of risks. That's going to be very important, how risks amplify in this network-based approach. And we therefore have to look at different spatial geographical scales. And above all, we need to look at secondary risks. For example, there have been 2 fairly recent incidences where floods have entered a factory, caused a massive explosion and a fire, which has led to a toxic cloud. So where's the disaster? Is it the flood, the explosion, the fire, or the toxic cloud? Which is the biggest disaster? In the case of the Tohoku triple disaster, G-Jet in Japan, Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami, what will be the enduring legacy of that? Is it the effect of the tsunami? I don't think it's the earthquake, the primary trigger, but it might be the nuclear release. I've actually been to Fukushima Daiichi, about 20 meters away from reactor 3. The radiation level outside my bus was the equivalent of 350 chest x-rays, but well, I'm still here, so. Anyway, black sky thinking. You've heard of blue sky thinking. You look up at the blue sky and you think creatively. Well, we do black sky thinking. What happens when the lights go out? Venezuela, for example, which has had a series of rotating blackouts. But there is an assumption that the lights will always be on. Worldwide, we have an average of one major power blackout a year. Major meaning prolonged, wide area, for example, the entire state of South Australia, or something like that. 2003, Italy propagated the blackout from the Alps to Western Sicily, etc. And here are some grid failures, for example. You can see them at night from the sky. Those are urban areas, the black bits, urbanized places. Right. So when electricity goes, then that also will affect water and sewage, electrically pumped, communications, electrically driven, refrigeration, which leads also to food toxicity, and a whole shed load of problems for food manufacture and storage, distribution, and of course toxicity effects medically. Banking fails. Denmark is apparently the country most dependent on electronic transfer that has almost eliminated cash. Is that a good idea? You get home from foreign travel, there's no electricity, you go down the supermarket, you fill up the cart with stuff, you go to pay for it, you put your card out, they won't take it, they can't get the till open, they won't even take cash, you haven't got any anyway, you can't get some from the ATM, etc., etc. But that's only the sort of simple domestic side of it. There's very much more, for example, buying a house. If you look into the mechanics of that process and the role of electricity in it, food and fuel supply failure. A study in the UK suggested that of critical generators, the generators we would depend upon for alternative supply of electricity, roughly 30% of them would work, and there would be a great wave of failures after 3 to 4 days. Hospital generators are highly unreliable, which could mean death in the operating theatre. I've seen it come very near to that in a hospital for which I was on the emergency planning committee, and the generator failed. Anyway, transportation failure, obviously, people stuck in tunnels, in electric trains, for example, or in lifts, elevators, and so on. Would it be a social success or failure? Now, in London, most people walk around or on public transport like this. That is all they do. They're visually illiterate. They don't see things. They have no way of interpreting the real world as it is, because all they ever see is a keyboard or a screen. Now, what would happen if there were no electricity? They'd be forced to talk to each other. Oh my God, OMG. Anyway, the triple disaster in Japan was a perfect, it was the grandmother of all cascading disasters. There are so many implications to it. And of course, there have been thousands of papers. Last time I looked, there were about 2,100, but it's probably now about 10,000 papers written on it. And you could look at things like suicide, for example, or the effect on schooling, and so on. The actual Fukushima disaster was caused by the collapse of an electricity pylon with a landslide on it, under it. I've actually seen it. It was still there when I visited the site. And I got about this far, but over here, there is this pylon. That cut off the last electricity supply to the cooling system. And thereafter, we get all sorts of problems. I've been friends with the governor of Fukushima Prefecture, who is a very nice gentleman with, fortunately, a strong sense of humour. But he has a very hard job to rehabilitate the reputation of Fukushima Prefecture, which is absolutely rock bottom, and nobody wants to buy anything with Fukushima stamped on it, for example, and yet most of the prefecture is utterly unharmed, but regardless of which. So that then is really the source of a very great deal of elements of cascade. And if you can remember back to Eyjafjallajökull, now I got stranded for 9 days, long enough to learn how to pronounce it, well, more or less. 6.5 days with no air transportation over 70% of Europe's airports, and the effect of that. Most of the studies of that have been related to meteorology and volcanology, with some on aeroengineering. which is all fair enough, and some on air traffic control. But 8.5 million people were stranded, and all sorts of things happened. For example, there was a cessation of the transportation of bone marrow for transplant. Symphony orchestras suffered because they lost revenue through not being able to go on tour. We were very close to the collapse of Ryanair and EasyJet, which I would personally not have lamented in the case of Ryanair, but anyway, that's a personal view, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, there are a whole series of knock-on effects of this, and they would have been very much greater if this had continued any longer at all. Even something like Grenfell Tower is a cascading disaster, very much so. There you are, 72 dead in a residential tower fire. What caused it? Well, principally the slackening of building regulations and the failure to enforce them. What is really striking about the Grenfell case, on which I have vast amounts of information, is that virtually all of the official information is negative. It shows indifference, corruption, failure to do anything, bad planning, absolutely nothing positive to say about it. Not one single piece of information that's come out of it from official sources has been positive. It's led to massive welfare and equity issues, bearing in mind that this happened in the richest local authority in the country, with the largest population of millionaires and billionaires, and the highest reserves of revenue of anywhere in the entire country. And yet people live in misery still as a result of this, nearly 2 years later. It was discovered then that there are 314 dangerous residential towers, and a furious debate started out as to who should pay for replacing the cladding, which has a tendency to do this. People therefore were living in absolute danger. They had to hire fire marshals around the clock. There were furious arguments about who should pay for that, and the problem is still not resolved. There is highly dangerous urban pollution with heavy metals and so on in the vicinity of this, not merely the tower but the surrounds. There have been health issues, and they've been serious. The building regulations are simply not good enough. They were allowed to use cladding that's highly dangerous. There were various other problems with gas and electricity supply that were also highly dangerous, and so it goes on. But we haven't talked really about the theory behind any of this yet, so we better quickly do that. Cascading escalation of secondary events. And sometimes, indeed quite often, the secondary event is what matters, not the primary one. So there may be some event, a fire, a landslide, or what, and you've got to get on with it. Escalation points, therefore, are what we need to deal with. Escalation means the interaction of vulnerabilities, and that occurs at different levels in space and over time, and with respect to different kinds of exposure. We've written a lot of papers about it. We also find that cascades relate to a variety of other complexities, and one thing we could do, you can look at this at your leisure later, but simplified risk, compound risk, multiple events. Okay, interacting risk, environmental drivers of different kinds of risk. We've got plenty of those. You probably know a lot more than I do about them. Interconnected risk, natural, human, technological. Cascading, tightly coupled, networked. And composite, any of the above together. Very challenging, very difficult, but it's got to be done by creating scenarios for emergency planning. And don't forget space weather. UK is the only country that has a daily space weather forecast. It could do immense damage if we have a coronal mass ejection or sunspot flare that within 15 to 20 hours will arrive at the Earth and start to create havoc, above all with GNSS, global positioning systems, and with electricity and communications, telecommunications. In 1859, Richard Carrington was looking at the sun with his telescope, trained on a piece of paper, biggest sunspots ever. He sketched them, dashed off to get his wife as a witness. By then they'd gone. The Carrington event meant you could send a telegraph message without turning the telegraph on. Such were the geomagnetic currents. And yet in 660 BC, ice cores from Greenland suggest that there was a Carrington event 10 times larger And in 2012, another one just missed the Earth. And they would really create havoc. Do you want to be landing at Zurich Airport when there is a 50-meter vertical error in GPS, bearing in mind it's not the pilot who lands your aircraft, but the computer? So we have, a magnitude classification that yours truly invented of disaster. This would be Japan. Anything else would be a smaller event with a shorter chain, but nevertheless with escalation points at various intervals in it for the most part. So how do we manage cascades? Trigger of the event, strategic and tactical levels, dialogue between professionals, people like you, policies and plans with scenarios in them. Broaden the impact analysis, context, again, context. Impact trees, escalation points, very important that, and stress tests, very, very topical, very fashionable at the moment, stress tests. We all get them, but anyway, we need them. Okay, if I'm allowed a moment or two, I can go like a dose of salts through the Sendai framework, simply because I was asked to talk about it. You can read up on what it is, I'm not going to tell you, but here are some critiques of it. There we are, that's Riku's and Takata in Japan. Non-binding, therefore, will anyone do anything? Unscrupulous politicians can be legitimized by it. I've seen that happen here in Switzerland. Is top-down the right way to do things? That's something you could shout in Geneva at the conference next week, the UN Global Platform. Evidence is collected on whether it works, but we use evidence very selectively. Accountability, still weak, despite attempts to jack it up a bit. Well, the UN's answer to the top-down problem was, let's have a 10-point action plan for cities. We get the mayors round the table. I've seen that done in Geneva too, and very impressive it was. Field assessment, implementation in cities, this is Bogota, by the way. Sign up to the initiative, of which about 1% of global cities have. Go for critical installations, such as schools and hospitals, make them safe. All a very good idea. Trouble is that only 1% of world's urban areas have signed up, and do they actually do anything? Some do, some don't. But take the case of Venice, for example. Safe Cities role model, and that's Venice on an ordinary day. Yes, it's a real picture. It does look like that. Is that safe? Venice is the master of propaganda, but not fact. Great. So my last thing is really 12 quick questions, awkward questions about the SFDRR, which were written in a session at London's Royal Society with the leaders of the Sendai framework, the head of what was then UNISDR, and outside there was a West Indian steel band that energetically played the same tune over and over again for 2.5 hours. It was more interesting than the talks on the Sendai framework. Do we need the Sendai framework, and why? Whether or not it's good or bad, will it have an impact? Will it actually reduce losses? Are there alternatives? Is there a better alternative that perhaps isn't so top-down? Who will hold governments to account and shame them? They need shaming. The wording, does it affect losses? So much effort went into debating the wording of it. Can it ever be anything but top-down, and does that matter? Is top-down toxic, or does it work? Should, the should ratio, on my blog site there's something about should. Should is a damnable word. You know, we all should. At the moment I should be marking exams rather than being here, but anyway. 21 times, not too bad. That's a quite low should ratio. Should ratio is how many times should appears per page or per document. We all should. Anyway, disaster risk creation. Does DRR, reduction, have any meaning? Science for whom? Yes, science for Sendai, good idea, but science for whom? Is it really science for the disadvantaged? And what happens when we have a corrupt, unethical government? We seem to have more and more of those. Does globalization render DRR, the Sendai framework, redundant, incapable of being implemented? And is it unhealthy to promote a top-down culture? civil protection worked from the bottom up, from the local area. Local area is always the theatre of operations. When it all struck me as being a bit like radioing down from space and saying, Houston, we have a problem, there's nothing we can do about it because nobody has told us to. If you've got a DRR problem, get on with it and do something. So, to conclude, this is what we have in the world, right? Don't forget gender. We have a gender and disasters network. We have a gender and disasters study centre in my department, my institute. Very important. And are we merely rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? That's the Titanic. That's a photograph of people rearranging the deck chairs. Great. That's the menu. So there you are. Sorry to be a bit over and a bit breathless. But, that is a stacker.
So David, thank you very much for this broad overview. A lot of challenges you gave us for this workshop. I think we can't address all of them, but I think we have time here for questions where you can have the experience and our expert David Alexander here to ask about risk, resilience, and all the different things. Who wants to start? Yeah.
So, my name is Margreth Keiler. I work at University of Bern in Germany. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. You nicely showed the conceptualization of risk and how hazard and vulnerability can be taken as element for risk assessment. Also, you showed it from the resilience concept. But for me, for assessing risk, how do you place resilience for assessing risk? For hazard and vulnerabilities, which is clear, but for assessing risk, how do you place resilience concept?
That's a very deep, very difficult question. And what people usually say is, that's a very good question, but I always think when people say that, they should provide a very good answer, and I can't. So, okay, well, what are we going to do about conceptualizing resilience and how are we going to do it? One problem with that is that there are places and situations in which resilience has been regarded as an imposition and a negative thing. For example, in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And I was reflecting as you were speaking there about Grenfell Tower in London and about indifference to resilience, indifference to vulnerability, of which there is a lot there, and the fight to try to install some sense of recognizing vulnerability so that we can create resilience. And what resilience there is in that instance is very much locally generated by networks of ordinary people on the ground at the local level. To do that, though, we need to understand the concept of community, and you can be skeptical about community because it is very hard to define, and a lot of people have taken it unquestioningly as sort of saying community can solve problems, but community is not always positive, it's not always therapeutic. Terry Cannon, for example, who is a very well-known disasterologist, studied a place in India where there was a fantastic sense of community. It was all under the chief of the local area who was very good at producing flood defences. He got people to work on them. If they didn't work on them, he had them killed. And Terry said, and there I was shaking hands with the mass murderer. So community, what is it? I mean, we are a community and we all come from very different places. So it doesn't necessarily have a spatial connotation. We need to mobilize at the local level in so many instances, and we need to try to ensure that people take control of their own destiny in as much as it is possible. There's so many counter-currents to that if you look at context. People have been dispossessed by proxy wars, by globalization, by the wreckage economy, by exploitation and so on. Unfortunately, we're not going to get much disaster resilience unless we can reverse trends like that and give people some control over their own destiny, which I'm afraid means politics, and it means that actually power relations are the key to a very great deal of what we're dealing with. because power relations govern decision making.
Okay, thank you for this explanation. Are there further questions? Yeah. Yep, you can go.
So I was wondering if you could comment on the success stories, because the word resilience to me seems like it's only used whenever a disaster happens. Last year we had a major drought in the Netherlands, and everything was in place to prevent any bad things from happening. For example, we always have a good supply of fresh water to keep the seawater out. Our cooling systems of the nuclear power plants, they work on these fresh water supplies. But there was never a problem because everything was so well organized. So then you're talking about planning and preparedness. So you don't hear the word resilience, just planning and preparedness.
Right. I think that's also, resilience is often a semantic issue. They like to use it a lot in the UK as a sort of synonym for planning and preparedness. If they don't use it, it doesn't matter at all. The important thing is to do something, and something positive. So yes, it is true. One tends to focus on the negative, and there are plenty of inspiring cases around the world. I do quite a bit of teaching in the Netherlands, and I'm always inspired by what goes on there, quite honestly. I think it punches well above its weight for a small country in the disaster reduction field. But it's surprising where you can find good examples. In some respects, Bangladesh has got some very good aspects to its preparedness. It works hard, it's very multidimensional, a little bit too traditional in some respects, but there is now a growing and large emphasis on studying the human dimensions of disaster in Bangladesh, which before they didn't do, and that's a positive step as well. If you look at Italy, disaster response began in 1244 with the Venerable Confraternity of the Misericordia, and grew, and that organization, now national, has been there since 1244. In all recent Italian disasters, there have been more rescuers than there have been population. For example, in the L'Aquila earthquake, there were 94,000 volunteers in the field. Population of L'Aquila city, 68,900. Quite remarkable. 3/4 of the vehicles on the road for 3 months were emergency vehicles. So overwhelming response, although the ability of Italians to get the risk down is very constrained, above all by an old building stock. But places like that often generate a very lively debate on this and very many different initiatives. The question then is, how far can they get? And the answer to that lies in whether the political situation is fertile or not. In the UK at present, it certainly isn't. In fact, national governance is being utterly neglected because of the Brexit question. The Brexit question has got an awful lot of very, very negative things to it and is being viewed as a cascading disaster. For example, horror of horrors, it is discovered that the UK has 24-hour autonomy in coffee. What are we to do? But coffee also is the mainstay of a zillion coffee shops, and therefore of bits of the economy as well. And so it goes on. But here am I going back to the negative side rather than the positive side. An awful lot of people are working very hard to mitigate.
Okay, one short question and a short answer, please. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Alexander. My question is rather conceptualizing is the implementation of resilience, because if we accept resilience is a good paradigm as an objective for communities to proactively respond to this disaster. Theoretically, we have a lot of frameworks measuring operationalization, and from policy side, we have post-United Nations agendas all highlighting resilience, but non-binding. What about the implementation, linking theories to practice? Which alignments is necessary for resilience to be applied in the mostly, community level?
Right. Well, it's very important factor, and that's common sense.
Okay, that was really short.
But I'll talk to you about it over coffee.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I want just to say, very important for me, what I got as well is that we're in an age of disaster risk creation, and that what we saw, that there's a lot of interfaces what we should address, and I think that's the challenge, how we address them, how we measure them, how we link all these different things, what was really well presented in the talk of David Alexander, and some parts we can integrate it, perhaps keep that in the background for the workshop and how we can create this. So thank you very much.